In case you think that the Great Plains are nothing but straight, endless roads, or just fields of corn that stretch on forever, think again. Here in Nebraska, there are also natural spires that pierce the sky, beaches that don't look like they belong in the Great Plains at all, and herds of creatures that have roamed the American heartland for millennia. Aerial Nebraska soars across great wide open spaces where the American West begins. Spaces that inspired one early settler to write her now famous stories of life on the frontier, and led a Nebraskan farmer to invent a machine that transformed the great American desert into these familiar circles of plenty. It was at a small Nebraskan high school that a young comedian turned his magic act into 35 infamous years on The Tonight Show. And it was in the state's biggest city that a savvy investor first turned the profits that would make him one of the world's richest men. But while the people of Nebraska have known great victory, they have also suffered enormous hardship. It's here that a native tribe was forced into exile on a trail of tears, where great storms of dust once drove many right off their land, and where terrifying tornadoes still ravage entire towns today. From the air, there's no end to the wonders of this Great Plains state, from rugged badlands where amazing ancient creatures once roamed, to a river valley still lined with the scars of those who settled the West, to miles of open prairie where American buffalo still roam. All this in the surprising land of Nebraska. When summer arrives in Nebraska, there's no doubt why its nickname is the Cornhusker State. Row after row of this one crop stretches to the horizon in every direction, almost everywhere you look. But these glistening green and gold stalks are not yet ready for harvesting. Farmers wait until they're dry and brown before getting out their combines and turning their fields into profits. 93% of Nebraska land is used for farming and ranching, which creates the tapestry of green and brown patterns that many of us see down below when we fly across the American heartland. But 200 years ago, none of these elaborate patterns existed. Until the 1830s, the only visible sign of human impact on the land would have been small settlements of Plains Indians. But that quickly changed in the 1830s and 40s, when hundreds of wagon trails started to be etched in the land by the tens of thousands of people that began flowing across the Great Plains in one of the biggest migrations in American history, and one that turned a Nebraska River Valley into the Route 66 of the 19th century. Most pioneers who set out for Oregon and California knew that crossing the endless prairie of the American heartland wasn't going to be easy. And that's why so many followed the wide and relatively flat Platte River Valley through Nebraska. Those traveling on the Oregon Trail came up through what's now Missouri and Kansas, while Mormon settlers on their way to Utah arrived through the Iowa Territory. To avoid conflicts with the other settlers, the Mormons followed the north bank of the river, while those on the Oregon Trail generally followed routes on the south bank, but all headed west. Mountain men, fur trappers, freedom seekers, and gold hunters all converged here. One traveler, William Johnston, described what it was like. There seemed to be an unending stream of emigrant trails. It was a sight which, once seen, can never be forgotten. These routes were so well traveled that wagon ruts from that era can still be seen from the air, etched in the land a century and a half later at a place called Windlass Hill. This hill was too steep for the wagons to roll down, so the pioneers locked the wheels instead and dragged their wagons down Windlass Hill, carving these deep ruts in the landscape. At the time, this region was only sparsely inhabited by Native Americans. And while settlers may have read sensationalized stories of Indian attacks, there was little actual risk of attack while they crossed Nebraska. What they did have to deal with were wagons tipping over, fierce sun and storms, poisonous snakes, and illness and accidents far away from doctors. Not to mention the daily challenge of feeding themselves and their oxen. As one traveler wrote, there was no wood, poor grass, plenty of muddy water. And unclean water could spread disease. Many died from cholera on the route and were buried in unmarked graves along the river where they fell. A few families managed to bury their dead here at the Ash Hollow Cemetery before they forged on. West of Ash Hollow, the open prairie stretches on, seemingly forever. It was here that many travelers started to scan the horizon, eagerly hoping to spot the first of a series of famous landmarks that would provide proof of their progress. Two soaring sandstone buttes known as Courthouse and Jail Rocks. Whoever first named these impressive formations could never have known that the names they gave them would soon be legendary and mark a welcome sight for the tens of thousands who followed. But setting eyes on Courthouse and Jail Rocks was only a temporary fix. As soon as the pioneers guided their wagons past these dramatic bluffs, they were trudging again across more monotonous prairie, and were soon scanning the horizon once more for a second marker on the trail. A sight that took most travelers 2 more days to reach. When they finally did, they were awed by what they saw. A stunning pinnacle that shot 500 feet up from the prairie and appeared to pierce the sky. Chimney Rock. For pioneers who had not yet set eyes on the landscapes of the American West, Chimney Rock was a hint of the wonders that lay ahead, which was one reason that this was the most mentioned landmark on the trail. Chimney Rock is actually made of clay, not stone, and until recently was 5 feet taller than it is today. A lightning strike in 1992 sheared 5 feet off the top of this impressive spire. Ever since it was first spotted by westbound pioneers, Chimney Rock has remained a favorite landmark for many crossing Nebraska. Which is why an image of the rock towering over a covered wagon was chosen for the Nebraska State Quarter. Today, Interstate 80 passes by Chimney Rock. This transcontinental highway stretches from New Jersey to San Francisco and follows the Platte River Valley as it passes through Nebraska, just like the Oregon and Mormon trails once did. Travel west on this highway, and you'll be on your way to Salt Lake City. But travel east, and you'll pass right through Nebraska's biggest city. A place once famous for liquor, brothels, and gambling, but is now celebrated as the home of a visionary investor known as the Oracle of Omaha. 1862 was a big year for Nebraska. That's when President Abraham Lincoln signed legislation supporting the first transcontinental railroad. The dream was for cars on rails, not wagon wheels, to steam across the Great Plains and help ferry people and goods from New York to California. For the new westbound rail lines, Lincoln chose a starting point in the Nebraska Territory, the city of Omaha. In 1865, work started on one of the biggest infrastructure projects in U.S. history, as the Union Pacific workers in Omaha began racing west to meet workers of the Central Pacific Railroad, who were laying their own tracks east from Sacramento, California. Omaha is still a major rail hub and is still home to the Union Pacific. But today, many don't think of Omaha for its railways, but for another corporate giant that's hard to spot from the air. Fly over the city of Omaha, Nebraska today, and you'd never know that it's home to one of the biggest and richest companies in America. That's because its headquarters aren't covered with a giant corporate logo. This plain-looking office tower is home to Berkshire Hathaway, the $430 billion company founded by a man known as the Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett. He's one of the most successful investors in history and got his start right here in town. Buffett grew up in this small white house on Barker Avenue. From a young age, he proved he had a knack for investing. He used to buy Coca-Cola from his grandparents' grocery store and then sell it for a profit. He would later go on to become Coca-Cola's biggest shareholder. In high school, he invested in a tenant farm and ended up making more money than his teachers did. Then, at 25, he launched his own investment firm with $100,000 in capital. Today, Buffett's personal net worth is over $50 billion, but he still lives in a house he bought for about $31,000 in 1958, which he claims is one of his best investments ever. In 2006, Buffett revealed plans to give his multi-billion-dollar fortune to charity, the biggest gift of its kind in U.S. history. When Warren Buffett was born in 1930, Omaha was undergoing big change. For more than 30 years, it had been ruled by a notorious crime boss named Tom Dennison, whose nickname was the Old Gray Wolf. Dennison had arrived in Omaha in 1892 with $35,000, which he turned into a fortune controlling the city's thriving prostitution, gambling, and bootlegging businesses right up until the 1930s. In 1932, Dennison was charged with conspiracy, but a jury was unable to decide on a verdict, and the case was declared a mistrial. By the time the Old Gray Wolf died in 1934, new reforms were cleaning up Omaha. One symbol of the new city was a newspaper called the Omaha Star. It was launched by Mildred Brown in 1938 as Omaha's first black newspaper. Brown wanted her paper to focus on positive news in Omaha's growing African-American community. She named it the Star because she saw it as a guiding light for many African Americans who, like her, had traveled up from the South with the Great Migration to seek freedom and opportunity in northern cities like Omaha. The Star is still being published today out of its original offices here at 24th and Grand, directly across the street from another Omaha landmark. Starting in the 1920s, this red brick building was the heart of Omaha's thriving music scene. Inside was the famous Dreamland Ballroom. On any given night, eager fans lined up outside, hoping for a chance to see some of the nation's greatest jazz musicians, including Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie. Today, Omaha's music scene continues to thrive. Many know it as the home of the independent label Saddle Creek Records. But what really put Omaha on the map in the 20th century was baseball. The College World Series was first played here in 1950 and has been every year since. TD Ameritrade Park is set to host the series until 2035. For the rest of the year, this stadium is the home of the Creighton Blue Jays and the United Football League's Omaha Nighthawks. From a railroad town, to a city famous for an underworld crime boss, to a home for jazz greats and World Series athletes, Omaha has managed to keep up with changing times. And there's no better place to see that than here, just southeast of downtown. These towering grain elevators once stored the bounty produced by Nebraska's farmers before it was loaded on trains heading east and west out of the state. But as the city's suburbs expanded, these soaring silos became harder and harder for farmers to access, and the rail lines that served them were finally removed. Local rock climbers started using the empty silos as giant climbing walls. In 2010, an arts organization launched a project to turn these white industrial relics into enormous canvases for all the city to see. Over 1,000 artists proposed banners around the themes of agriculture and transport. 26 were selected. Today, this giant art wall celebrates the productivity of the Nebraska landscape. The grain that once filled these silos flowed in from across the state, from fields that are still being farmed today. Nebraska's agricultural output is astounding, especially when seen from the air. And especially when you consider what much of this state looked like in the 1880s. Like this piece of land known as the Willa-Cather Memorial Prairie. Amazingly, these 608 acres have never been plowed or planted, which makes this a unique ecosystem. It's home to important native Nebraskan species of plants and offers important nesting sites for migrating birds. It's named for writer Willa-Cather, who arrived in Nebraska in 1883 as part of a giant wave of settlement that transformed the Great Plains into the industrial powerhouse it is today. It all started in 1862. That's when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law. Its purpose was to settle vast swaths of what the U.S. government considered empty land, even though much of this land was still lived on and sacred to many Native American tribes. For a small fee of just $18, the law entitled anyone over 21 and the head of a family to claim 160 acres of land. The only requirement was that they stay for 5 years and farm it successfully. And if they did that, the land was theirs for good. The first person to file a homestead claim was a man named Daniel Freeman. He lined up at midnight, January 1st, 1863, and was granted his 160 acres near what's now the Nebraska town of Beatrice, becoming America's first successful homesteader. Today, Daniel Freeman's original plot is the site of the Homestead National Monument, which celebrates those who took the risk and first settled the Great Plains. The Heritage Center, at its heart, was designed with a roof to look like an old-fashioned plow, to symbolize the hard work it took to be a successful homesteader. But it also took great mental strength and patience. There were very few towns at the time, and the nearest neighbors could be miles away. Homesteaders often endured extreme isolation and loneliness. Nebraska novelist Willa-Cather, a homesteader herself, put it this way in her novel, My Antonia. There seemed to be nothing to see. No fences, no creeks or trees, no hills or fields. There was nothing but land. Not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made. The task of turning 160 acres of empty prairie into productive farmland, using only the simplest of tools, could be overwhelming. Alone, out there on the plains, many suffered from what's been called prairie madness. Some just packed up all they could and gave up. But others stuck it out. Today, many family farmers here still work the fields that were first plowed in Nebraska by their forebears. These days, modern-day farmers may use high-tech tools, but it's still hard work to turn prairie soil into profits. Back in 1867, it was thanks to the hard work and productivity of its farmers that the Nebraska Territory was deemed ready to become the nation's 37th state. When Nebraska was a territory, Omaha had served as its capital. But after statehood, a town called Lancaster to the southeast was chosen instead and renamed Lincoln. But it took 3 tries for Nebraska to build itself a new state house. The first 2 capitals had to be torn down because of structural problems. In 1920, the state held a national design competition. The winning plans promised to make Nebraska stand out from the other 36 states that had come before it. It was the first state capital in the nation that did not follow the common neoclassical designs used by other states. And for the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., Nebraska's State House was designed to look like an office tower instead of a Roman temple. Finished in 1932, it stands 400 feet tall and is capped by a dome of mosaic tiles. On top is a statue known as the Soar, an iconic figure sowing seeds to celebrate Nebraska's rich agricultural heritage. Today, Lincoln is a thriving city of just over 250,000, thanks in large part to its university. Just 2 years after statehood, the University of Nebraska was founded here in downtown Lincoln. Its new hall and library soon towered over the plains, surely awing many young pioneers who'd grown up in sod-covered houses on the prairie. Today, the U of N is still going strong, including its Cornhusker football team, which plays here at Lincoln's Memorial Stadium. Ever since it was built in 1923, it's been getting bigger and can now seat at least 81,000 people, 1/3 of the population of Lincoln itself. But no matter how many fans have been able to pack its seats, this stadium has been sold out every game since November 3rd, 1962. One reason for that is legendary coach Tom Osborne, who reigned here for a quarter of a century. He led the team to back-to-back College Bowl titles in 1994 and 1995. Other University of Nebraska bright lights include Tonight Show host Johnny Carson and author Willa Cather. Sports are serious business for U of N students, but you won't find anyone running on this track on the west side of campus. That's because it's for farm machines, not people. It's part of a facility called the Tractor Test Lab. It was established in the 1920s to protect consumers from false advertising claims made by tractor manufacturers. Today, lab workers use this track to run new models of American tractors through their paces and ensure they meet tough international standards. Once they receive a stamp of approval from the U of N, they're allowed to be sold in countries around the world. Today, tractors are high-tech tools. Whether they're planting or harvesting, many models are guided almost entirely by GPS technology that helps make modern-day farming one of the most efficient industries in the country and creates fields lined with perfectly planted rows of crops. But it's not tractors that create the amazing tapestry of green and brown circles that we see when we fly across the Great Plains. It's the work of a Nebraska native whose dreams of inventing a super sprinkler enabled farmers to turn millions of dusty acres into fields of gold. When summer arrives in Nebraska, it's easy to be convinced that every inch of this state is covered by fertile fields. Its rows of corn alone seem to go on forever. In 2013, farmers here planted 100 million acres of this one crop, the largest amount since 1933. But there is a place in Nebraska where the farm fields come to an end. A place where there's nothing to see but dunes of sand. It's an area known as the Nebraska Sandhills. Here, rolling dunes cover 20,000 square miles of land, making this the largest formation of dunes in the Western Hemisphere. The Sandhills were created during the last ice age, when this region of North America was suffering from severe drought. As winds blew across the dry earth, great dunes of sand were formed. Later, thick grass and plants took root, stabilizing the sand and creating this remarkable landscape. But these dunes play a key role in making Nebraska an agricultural powerhouse. They're part of a complex ecosystem that is responsible for supplying Nebraska farmers and millions of people across the Great Plains with the precious water they need to survive. That's because under the Sandhills is a geological formation that contains vast amounts of water. It's so big, it stretches under the states of South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and even New Mexico. It's like a giant underground lake and is called the Ogallala Aquifer. The impact of this aquifer on the American economy is astounding. 30% of all groundwater used for irrigating crops in the U.S. comes from this one water source. Scientists discovered the Ogallala Aquifer in the 1890s, but even though they knew it was there, farmers didn't have an effective way to get that water out of the ground and onto their crops, which is one reason they suffered hard during a famous period known as the Dust Bowl. In the 1930s, farmers across western Nebraska and throughout the Great Plains were overplowing their fields after years of good rain and productive yields. When the rain stopped, the winds started to howl, picking up giant clouds of dust, since the grass to hold it in place had been plowed under. It destroyed entire fields, blinded cattle, and ruined machinery, bringing farmers to their knees. One farmer later described what happened. The birds fluttered, the rabbits ran, and the sky turned black. We thought it was a twister. The dust lay so thick in the back bedroom we just moved the mattress into the middle so we could sleep. Many Nebraskan farmers lost their farms to clouds of dust, even though those same farms stood right on top of one of the greatest sources of fresh water in the world. At the time, the technology to tap that water successfully had not yet been invented, which is why the Great Plains was often called the Great American Desert. But fly high over western Nebraska today, and in places, all you see are green fields, endless circles and squares of corn, alfalfa, and wheat. Nebraska now has more irrigated land than any other state. So how did the Great American Desert become one of the most productive areas of land in the world? The answer is a Nebraska inventor named Frank Zyback. In 1947, Zyback was living in neighboring Colorado. A tinkerer from childhood, he dreamed of finding a way to tap the water in the Ogallala Aquifer and spread it on fields using a super sprinkler, something that wouldn't require heavy manpower or moving pipes and pumps every time a new section of field needed watering. In 1949, he introduced his brilliant solution, which he called the Zyback self-propelled sprinkling apparatus. It was essentially a long sprinkler on wheels that could turn in a circle from a central pivot point and spray water in all directions. And best of all, it was self-powered. The water pumped through its pipes drove gears that turned the sprinkler's wheels. Zyback returned to Nebraska in 1952, and soon the state's farmers were using his central pivot irrigator. All they needed to do was dig a well to the aquifer, pump the water into the irrigator, and then let it go. In just 72 hours, even while a farmer slept, a single irrigator could cover an entire field evenly with the water its crops needed. Some called it the best thing since the invention of the tractor. Today, when NASA scientists focus their cameras down on the area that was once called the Great American Desert, this is what they see. Endless green circles and squares, all fed by the natural wonder of the Ogallala Aquifer and an innovative technology designed by a Nebraska native. The only problem is, As farmers pump more and more water into their fields, the levels in the Ogallala are dropping dangerously fast, threatening America's breadbasket and the nearly 2 million people who rely on it for their drinking water. Some fear that in just 20 years, the water will be gone and the great American desert will be back for good. That's why some farmers have voluntarily reduced the amount of water they pump out every year. But strangely enough, scientists have discovered that the desert-like landscape of the Nebraska Sandhills is essential to the aquifer's survival. This dune ecosystem acts like a giant sponge, absorbing rainwater and funneling it down into the aquifer below. In some places where the dunes dip, the water even comes to the surface, creating wetlands that are used by ranchers to raise their cattle and helping make this one of Nebraska's most impressive landscapes. A vast, nearly empty expanse of sand, grass, water, and livestock. Ever since the Dust Bowl, Nebraskans haven't been taking any chances to make sure they have the water they and their crops need. In 1936, work began on a giant new dam project to create 2 new reservoirs known as Lake McConaughey and Lake Ogallala. Today, these 2 lakes provide enough water to irrigate 4 Nebraska counties. 22 miles long, McConaughey is the biggest lake in the state. Its unique white beaches that might look more at home on the Florida Panhandle aren't exactly the kind of sight most expect to see when flying across the Great Plains. Without the water from Lake McConaughey, many nearby farms would not be able to survive. And even when they do get water, farmers often have to find creative ways to keep it there. On sloped fields like these, water can simply run down the field and away, carrying precious seeds and topsoil with it. That's why many farmers practice contour farming. Instead of planting in straight lines, they plant in rows that hug the curves of the land. And they use bulldozers to create ridges between the fields that hold in the moisture. From high above, it creates impressive patterns on the plains. Since 70% of all corn grown in Nebraska gets water from irrigation at some point between the time it's planted and harvested, farmers here welcome the sight of storm clouds on the horizon. Without rain that fills up the aquifers under this state and nourishes the crops above, Nebraska farmers would have nothing to harvest. But the problem is, the same storms that bring rain can also turn deadly in a matter of seconds. Nebraska lies in Tornado Alley, which means every year, some farmers here get hit hard by giant twisters that tear across the plains. It's May 2013, in the Nebraska town of Edgar, close to the state's border with Kansas. Just yesterday, a tornado tore right through this small town. From the air, the damage is clearly visible. One farmer lost this new corn silo when it was ripped to shreds, its walls wrapped around a nearby tree. Another farmer's storage building was leveled. There's no predicting when or where tornadoes in Nebraska will hit, but farmers and their property often suffer the most. Damaged structures, fields destroyed, and trees pulled right out of the ground. One of the biggest tornado events in Nebraska history took place here in the town of Grand Island on June 3, 1980. On that one night, a freakish weather event caused 7 tornadoes to touch down in or near this one town, killing 5 and injuring almost 200. It inspired a novel called The Night of the Twisters, which later became a television movie. Soon after, officials had to figure out what to do with tons of debris caused by the tornadoes. They decided to bring it all here and pile it up in the center of town at Ryder Park. Today, that debris pile has been covered in grass and serves as a landmark called Tornado Hill, a memorial to everything this town lost. Today, catastrophic winds can transform entire Nebraska communities in seconds. But in the far west of this state, it took millions of years for wind and rain to create what is now one of America's most stunning landscapes. There's a place in Nebraska where it's still possible to imagine what this land was like long before it was a state or a territory or even called Nebraska at all. A place where the prairie drops away to reveal a moonscape of jagged sandstone cliffs and canyons. Some call it Nebraska's Badlands. It's also known as Toadstool Geologic Park and was formed millions of years ago when a broad river flowed across western Nebraska and carved a path through a bed of ancient sandstone rock. Wind, water, and time did the rest, chiseling the sandstone into forms that might look more at home on the moon than the Great Plains. Evidence of amazing creatures that once called this part of Nebraska home have been found here in fossils. They included saber-toothed cats, three-toed horses, large creatures that looked like pigs, and 8-foot-tall, 4-ton herbivores called brontotheres that probably looked a little like today's rhinos. Those creatures died out roughly 30 million years ago as the Great Plains subtropical landscape gradually dried out, and as new species emerged, including the ancestors of one that can still be found in Nebraska: elk. Today, 100 head of elk roam free here at the Fort Niobrara National Wildlife Refuge. It was created in 1912 by President Theodore Roosevelt to help protect the wildlife that called the Great Plains home and were being threatened by hunting and settlement. This refuge covers more than 19,000 acres. It lies on the banks of a Nebraska treasure, the Niobrara River, which carves a lush green path west to east across northern Nebraska. Before pioneers and settlers claimed this fertile valley as their own, it was the homeland of a tribe called the Ponca. They fished its rivers, hunted on nearby prairie, and sheltered in homes made of earth and animal skins. The Ponca were one of many Native American tribes that once called Nebraska home, along with the Arikara, the Pawnee, Omaha, Sioux, and others. By 1800, historians believe there may have been as many as 40,000 Native Americans living in the region. But in less than 100 years, their way of life would be destroyed by the arrival of the U.S. government and thousands of settlers. It all started in 1804, when a party led by explorers Lewis and Clark set out up the Missouri River and met with members of the Oto tribe, here at a place Lewis and Clark called Council Bluff. A meeting that's remembered today by this group of bronze statues. Little did the Oto or Lewis and Clark know at the time that the site of their meeting would become Fort Atkinson, one of the largest U.S. military forts on the frontier, a gateway to the west. Soldiers here protected fur traders and early settlers as they fanned out across the Great Plains, and as they came into increasing conflict with the Native American tribes that called this land home. Tribes like the Ponca that would soon lose all their land. Following treaties signed in 1858 and 1865, the Ponca were forced to crowd onto a small reservation along the Niobrara River. But a few years later, in 1868, the U.S. government gave that same land to the Sioux by mistake in another treaty. But instead of giving the Ponca back their land, the U.S. government decided to send the tribe 600 miles away to a reservation that lies in what's now Oklahoma. In summer 1878, U.S. soldiers marched 660 Ponca south at gunpoint in what became known as the Ponca Trail of Tears. Traveling more than 600 miles by foot, most members of the tribe became sick or disabled. 1/3 died en route or soon after. One of those is still remembered today, here, just outside the town of Neely, when a 1-year-old Ponca named White Buffalo Girl died on the journey. Her father, Black Elk, made a unique request to the settlers living nearby. I want the whites to respect the grave of my child, just as they do the graves of their own dead. I leave the grave in your care. To this day, the people of Neely still honor Black Elk's request and place flowers on White Buffalo Girl's gravestone 365 days a year. In 1879, the great Ponca chief Standing Bear left Oklahoma and led a group of Ponca back to Nebraska. But before they could reach their homeland in the Niobrara Valley, the chief was arrested. He was brought to Fort Omaha, which stood here on the Missouri River. On the former fort grounds lies the house of General George Crook, who arrested Standing Bear under orders from Washington. But Crook quickly realized that Standing Bear's treatment was not only unfair, but immoral. At the time, the U.S. government did not actually consider Native Americans to be people with the same rights as white American citizens. It was in this house that Crook worked secretly to help publicize Standing Bear's mistreatment and help the chief sue the government for his freedom by arguing that he too was a person with the same rights as any other. Speaking through an interpreter, Standing Bear argued, "My hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you also feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be the same color as yours. I am a man. God made us both." Standing Bear's historic case, which he won, kicked off a long battle for Indian rights that finally led the U.S. government to grant Native Americans citizenship in 1924, and is still being waged today all across the nation. In Standing Bear's lifetime, great change swept across Nebraska. In the days of his youth, the Great Plains looked much like they had for centuries. Once, millions of bison roamed freely over endless miles of pristine grassland. Today, there are just a few herds left, including this one, 350 strong, at the Fort Niobrara National Wildlife Refuge. They are the survivors of a tale of gore that began in the 1830s, when hunters started slaughtering these massive herbivores to collect their tongues, which were a delicacy, and their hides for leather. One of those hunters was a man named William Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. He acquired his famous nickname in a hunting contest when he killed 69 bison in a span of just 8 hours. But it wasn't bison hunting that paid for his new home and ranch here in central Nebraska. It was showbiz. Long before there were colorful Hollywood westerns, there was Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The frontier-themed spectacle included horse riding, cattle roping, and an appearance by Annie Oakley, the notorious sharpshooter. Buffalo Bill took the show on the road, across the U.S., then to Europe, where he helped the American frontier grow into legend. With the money he earned, Buffalo Bill bought 4,000 acres of land here, near North Platte, and built himself a Victorian mansion. He called the property Scouts Rest Ranch. Today, it's the centerpiece of the Buffalo Bill State Historical Park. Even while Buffalo Bill was working as a showman, he was also a real rancher, raising cattle at Scouts Rest Ranch, in an age when the Nebraska beef industry was just starting to take off. Today, there are about 4 cows for every 1 person in Nebraska. They begin their lives on the ranch land that covers half the state. But their last 3 to 6 months are spent in feedlots like this one. The primary goal of the feedlot is to do exactly what the name suggests: feed and fatten up the cows before they're sent to the slaughterhouse. Ranchers pay these facilities so their cattle can be sold to the meat packers for the highest price. They're fed a high-energy diet that gives the meat its fatty, marbled appearance. The weight of a cow in a feedlot can nearly double in just 90 days. Representatives from the meat packers come here to see what they're buying and strike deals with the ranchers. Then, the cows are shipped to slaughterhouses like this one in Grand Island. After they're unloaded, each rancher's cows are held in separate pens. Beef production is the largest industry in Nebraska and a model of efficiency. Long ago, when Plains Indians hunted American bison, they found a use for every part of the animals they killed. Today, the modern meat industry uses every part of every cow slaughtered for one product or another. An average cow weighs about 1,300 pounds. More than half of that is edible beef. The rest is used for leather upholstery, fishing line, pet shoes, and even as ingredients in gummy candies. In 2006, a federal crackdown on illegal immigrants from Mexico left these meatpacking plants with a shortage of workers. So the companies recruited legal immigrants from Somalia instead. To accommodate these new Muslim workers who need to pray 5 times a day, some meatpacking companies have agreed to give them 15 minutes of additional break time. But that doesn't slow down the seemingly endless stream of cattle that are herded into the plant, helping Nebraska slaughterhouses produce close to 8 billion pounds of red meat a year. With so many cows in this state, ranchers in Nebraska graze them just about anywhere they can, even on top of these old munitions bunkers just south of Grand Island. It's easy to drive by this facility and just think it's a series of grass-covered hills, or imagine that they're homes in a deserted district of the Hunger Games. But from the air, they're a clear reminder of the important role that Nebraska played in World War II. Each structure is a separate bunker, built to hold ammunition, that was made right here in Nebraska. In 1942, officials selected the state for the site of an enormous wartime manufacturing facility called the Naval Ammunition Depot. Thousands of Nebraskans once worked here, making bombs, rockets, torpedoes, and mines, all of which were then stored in the bunkers before being sent to the battlefield. At its peak, this facility produced 40% of the munitions used by the Navy during the war. 70 years later, farmers use the bunkers for animal feed, and others think they might be perfect to house electronic data servers. A vast complex of World War II bunkers may be a surprising sight on the Nebraska prairie, but it's not the only one. To the west, pivot point irrigation circles blanket the landscape. But there's one circle here that stands out from the rest. It's a modern American tribute to a mysterious ancient English monument, Stonehenge. Except this Nebraska version is called Carhenge and is made from the stripped-out bodies of Chevys, spray-painted stone gray instead of from stone itself. It's the brainchild of artist Jim Reinders, who built Carhenge in 1987 after living in England. Reinders designed his monument to be the same as the original, including its 96-foot diameter, layout, and distance between the cars. Reinders even positioned the cars along the same compass points as Stonehenge. He says he built it as a tribute to his father, who farmed the land on which Carhenge lies today. One Nebraskan in particular who would have appreciated Carhenge was comedy genius Johnny Carson. This is the city of Norfolk on the state's eastern side. Long before Carson became the star of The Tonight Show and America's most beloved comedian, he grew up here. His family moved to Norfolk when he was 8 and lived in this small brown roofed house. When he was 14, he went to this Norfolk school, now named Johnny Carson Junior High. There, he developed a magic act, which he called the Great Carsoni. It became a local hit. Johnny would later feature his Carsoni character on The Tonight Show. When Johnny Carson left Nebraska as a young man, he was following a long tradition in this state. A tradition of heading out across the Great Plains to seek fame and fortune in the West. But unlike Carson, many before him discovered Nebraska on foot, wagon, and horseback. That's how they would have first set eyes on these towering forms that are known as Scott's Bluff. As they wound their way through these impressive towers of clay, Native Americans and pioneers alike were awed by the power and ancient beauty of these 33-million-year-old landmarks. Today, the best way to appreciate these natural wonders and the wonder of Nebraska itself is to experience them all from the air.